Okay, so there's four main lobes within the cerebral cortex. There's the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The frontal lobe, its main function is to maintain concentration. It holds a person's personality. It helps with containing the inhibition a person may have. And it also contains the Broca's area. I'm going to discuss a lot more about Broca's area, but Broca's area is when a person speaks short phrases that make sense, but is produced with great effort. They understand everything that someone is saying, but typically they are speaking in short phrases. I'll talk about that a lot more. Within the temporal lobe is where auditory processing occurs. The way I like to think about it, since it's on the side of the brain, it's located near your ear, so it's where auditory processing occurs, and it's also where memory is held. So it's kind of important to understand if someone has a stroke within the temporal lobe, they may have some sort of memory loss that occurs. Also, this is where the Wernicke's area is located as well. Wernicke's area is where a person may speak in long sentences and it has no meaning whatsoever and is very difficult to understand what they're trying to say. Typically, a person who has Wernicke's aphasia, it becomes extremely frustrated because they have no control of how they are saying their sentences. The third lobe is considered to be the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is where sensory input is registered, sensory discrimination is registered, and where body orientation is. Sensory discrimination, it allows you to understand what a marker feels like versus what an eraser feels like. You are able to discriminate what each object feels like within within your sensory cortex. The fourth lobe is the occipital lobe, and now that is where vision processing occurs. The way I like to think about it is like a movie theater system. If you have a projector at in the back of your brain, it's projecting towards your eyes over here, and that's where vision processing occurs. Within your brainstem, we have a few anatomical structures. The first being the Pons. The Pons is where the respiratory center is contained, and is where it regulates breathing. And then we have the medulla, is where decussation occurs. Decussation is where sensory nerves and motor nerves cross over into the brainstem, whether it's going towards the motor cortex or the sensory cortex, depending on what the function is, but it's the crossing over of those nerves. The function of the brainstem itself is to regulate breathing. It controls heart rate and blood pressure control, and that's also where the vomiting center is contained. Within the cerebellum, which is also located in the lower section of the brainstem, is where coordination is contained and where muscle tone is registered. So we also have the sensory cortex, which is mainly involved with the peripheral nervous system. So as decussation occurs, so let's say if I were to feel onto this eraser, there are certain tracks that we're not going to go into, but those tracks are going to travel through the spinal cord into the medulla and decussate, meaning it's going to cross over and travel into the sensory cortex where it's registered, and that's how I know what I'm feeling. The motor cortex is the opposite. It's where the CNS sends a message to the peripheries, meaning the central nervous system is going to send down signals to your peripheries, such as your fingers, and control motor functions such as abducting your hand. All right, so there are different types of nervous system when talking about neuroanatomy. The first is the CNS, also known as the central nervous system. Then there's also the PNS, also known as the peripheral nervous system. So what does the CNS contain? It contains the brain and the spinal cord. The spinal cord is what carries sensory information from the peripheries to the brain. And then it also, what it does, it carries motor function information from the brain to the spinal cord. So for example, I grab this marker right here. I'm touching it. I'm feeling it. How is this registering within my brain? Well, let me show you. So, for example, I touched it. There's going to be the nerve impulse is going to be sent through the spinal cord columns, and then what it's going to do is going to travel to the medulla. Then as soon as it reaches the medulla, it's going to do something called decussation. It's going to decussate, so it's going to travel. It's going to cross over, and then the information is going to be sent to the parietal lobe, where sensory input is registered and discrimination is obtained. Okay, so there's also the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system involves sensory neurons and motor neurons. The sensory neurons is what carries information from the periphery to the CNS. The motor neurons, for example, carry information from the CNS to the periphery. So it's going from the brain, for motor functions, going from the brain, traveling down through the spinal columns to your periphery, such as your fingers, your toes. There's subsections of the motor neurons. There's the somatic neurons and the autonomic neurons. Somatic neurons are considered to be voluntary muscles. So for example, if I'm going to raise up my hand, I'm voluntarily moving up my arm, because the information that's sent from the CNS to the peripheries from the motor cortex is allowing me to do that function. So that's controlled voluntary movement. Now there's autonomic neurons, which is involved with involuntary smooth muscle. So these are things that we cannot control, such as cardiac muscle, which sends out that cardiac output. The respiratory muscles that's involved with breathing, and digestive muscles such as specific sphincters, depending, like pyloric sphincter, for example, that closes on its own. Those are things that we cannot control, that our body takes care of. Those are considered to be autonomic neurons.